we're here to celebrate this remarkable window on reality and on the future that has been invented by one of the USA Corps members, along with a German Club of Rome member, Mike Sarvich, as I've already said, and it's a new tool by which you could break down the behavior of the world. Now, we have to take ourselves back to the 1960s, and there weren't big models, and the world wasn't thinking in terms of a global awareness. Everybody was thinking country by country. Once in a while, Canada and the United States grouped, or Europe grouped, and they were thinking short-term, political term, and they were thinking discipline by discipline, so GDP, water and biodiversity, health. They were not integrating the disciplines. They were not integrating the globe. They were not integrating and looking at it in long time scale. I think Google Earth is the best example. That's a marvelous tool. And you see the Earth, and then you can zoom down on any group. Well, everything was zoomed down, and nothing was this big Google Earth kind of picture. And these gentlemen, the MIT group of Forrester, Meadows, and Dana Meadows, and Jorgen Randers, and then Masarovich, Pestel, Hughes, and the others who have refined this model have given us magnificent tools for looking at reality and looking at the future. And I think we should do a little to compare. At the beginning in the United States, there were 4 groups formed. One more or less at MIT with Forrester and Mike Meadows. And then there was another at the seat of power, Harlan Cleveland, who'd been in the diplomatic service, Walt Anderson, Don Michaels, World Bank people such as Harmon Daly, and then another in Cleveland. Mike moved to Cleveland, but it was a very appropriate place because it was the center of manufacturing and of industry at that time. And that was Talbot, Olivetti, Richardson. Later, Barry Hughes joined this group. And then Texas had its own group with John and Magda McHale, and of course, the late George Mitchell and others. And from that, and the Ottawa group, of course, was Rennie Whitehead and colleagues at that time. And this is what Aurelio Pache ran back and forth between Europe and Latin America and North America, getting organized. So we got our little license called USA Club of Rome in about 1974, 75, and 2 projects arose. One was the Forrester Meadows, as I've already said, and the other was the Masarovich Pestel, and they were models. Now, how are they slightly different? Meadows and Forrester look at the entire system as homogeneous. The Masarovich, Pestel, Hughes models take regions. And to me, as a biologist, it's clear that the Antarctic region is not the same as the little nations in the middle of the Pacific Island ocean. So region makes a lot of sense, not to average everything out. And second, the model of Forrester and Meadows talks about this is the way the trends are, and I, reading it, am an observer. And I sit there and I either shake my head, yes, I like this conclusion, or I shake my head, no, I'm violently opposed to this. Whereas Masarovich, Pestel, Hughes model allows me, this is an example, to go in and manipulate and create what I think are important futures from the actual 200,000 and more equations that make up the model. So that is a difference between the two. And I think third is it begins where we are now, and it can talk to on a nation by nation basis or a small region, say Central America, Caribbean. decision makers sitting in those countries who have important questions. Where do I put my budget? Do I put my funds in health, in child education? Where do I put it to have the most sustainable, by the time I go out of office, which is, I can be king for life like Castro, then is 50 years. Otherwise, it's about six to 8 years. So I think those are important differences between the two very important tools that we have. How well do these describe the Earth? And can we predict events? And I leave you with the thought that I think now we've had the models for 40 years, we should go back and see what the models predicted in 1972 and 74 and see what events of water or something straightforward with good measurements, child health or some other thing has happened. And we should see, as a scientist, we should compare what happened and what it was predicted. So I'd like to introduce you to Mike, who was born in what was then Yugoslavia. It had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries, and then it became, now is Serbia. And the names of the city has actually, you say
3 times.
3 times, yes, all right. So he was awarded a PhD from the Serbian Academy of Sciences in 1955 and served in the Nikola Tesla, a very famous name, Institute in Belgrade in the inspection department. And he was at the University of Belgrade, and suddenly, as Mike said, Tito blinked. So there was an opportunity for certain outstanding students and young faculty to visit Europe and the United States. And so he went to MIT and served there as professor for some year and plus, and then he went to Case Western Reserve, which of course is in Cleveland, as a systems engineering group. So Mike was trained as an electrical engineer, and of course he has 12 books which have enormously complex titles ranging from multivariable control system, published by MIT in 1960, to general systems theory of mathematical foundations in 75 and abstract systems theory in 94. And so therefore, if we don't understand them all because we're simply lay people trying to find out which is the best pathway to go and where we can best see the world progressing and where in our discipline we see a window on reality opening, which will be important for our career, for our functioning. This is why we lay people who are not modelers are so intent and interested in these. So Mike came to Case Western Reserve, and he has had a long and exceptional career there. And I will shut up and let Mike explain to you how the model came into being. And I must tell you, he is an American treasure. He may be a Serbian treasure, yes, but he is an American treasure, and we are terribly glad to have Mike here, and that's why we are filming this entire thing.
Well, thank you very much. I will read a number of quotations. Some are mine, most from somebody else. But I'm reading this because that describes me as a personality and why is what I have done, what I have done. These two things show, on one, all translations of the Menck and the Turning Point in 22 languages. And they sold like 200,000 copies. The second is about 20 or so books which I wrote on other topics. I introduced, launched system biology back when I figured out that in addition to population and so on, there are also people. And system biology is referred to as being launched by me many years ago. So I will read this, but let me mention at least briefly about model, right? And I will tell you two things. One, this is my daughter, Katerina.
System biology.
When she was in elementary school, and in that school there were students from professors and so on, she came and said, my friend told you're in modeling, they want to see you. And I said, I don't want to embarrass you. So, that is what, one thing about modeling. And the second thing what I want to just show you is a book by Michel Foucault. This is not a pipe. What you see is not a pipe. Ce n'était pas une pipe. This is picture of pipe. So when you look at this is model, but that's not real oil. And the whole book is about this. And there are many philosophical discussion about this. So we shouldn't confuse model with reality and so on to begin with. Now, I go back and I read some quotations and some of my thoughts in order again to provide background and in a sense show who am I, because I selected those, right? And also some of these are mine. Robert Heilbronner, way back, like maybe 30 years ago, he was an economist and also philosopher, and he gave a lecture here in New York in the library and wrote a book about evolution of Western society over centuries. And he said that he divided this into 3 parts. Before Newton and Darwin, it was a life after death. After Newton and Darwin, it was progress. And 21st century, he said, is complex. Right? So I think this is important to have in mind, right? Then quotation which I made at one point in time, complexity is not a curse. It is a tool to understand the whole. And that's our challenge. And system is the relation between items, whatever they are. And complex system is a system which has organizing principles so that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Complicated system doesn't have organizing principles. And in a sense, all of science is really what appeared to be complicated, to translate it into being complex. In human brain, if you take blood vessels in line, 400 kilometers. From your body, it's almost around the world. That is our challenge, to find the organizing principle. And again, to indicate the way I like to approach things, and I'm quoting Einstein here. He said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So I will try to do that. I will not give you mathematics or programs of the model and so on, because this is just a tool. For example, the United States is organized by basic definitions, and then they are translated into laws, and finally they are enforced. Right? In other words, constitutions and elements of constitutions are organized in principles. And the laws are application of this for a given set of circumstances. And in the courts, there are arguable things. So that applies to global model and so on. And again, in a sense, what is a challenge of the science of 21st century, to look into complex systems like what appears to be complicated system like brain, and try to figure out how the poems are being constructed and how problems have been raised. And that is our key challenge for all scientists and so on. Now, whenever you why do you worry about the future? A famous businessman, I forgot his name, that was 20 years ago or more, he said, I'm interested in the future because I'm going to spend the rest of my life there. It's as simple as that. You know, why? And I follow this by saying, what do you mean by that? And how you can approach that? And there are three ways you can do this. One is forecast, second is foresight, third is insight. Because that is what you're trying to do, to build a model or develop a story, but no. Forecast predicts or estimates the future events and trends. Rain is forecast for Eastern Ohio, for example. It is prediction. Prediction is estimate of future events in many of these instances. I like to, it comes to mind, prediction is fiction. And this goes like this, okay, here on the diagram. And then foresight is ability to predict or the action or predicting what will happen or be needed in the future. For example, he had the foresight to check that his escape rule was clear. Right? It's not a model. Right? He got the foresight. Right? And then comes insight, which is ability to perceive clearly or deeply penetration. A penetrating and often sudden understanding as of a complex situation or problem. Right? And so, in other words, insight is to understand. Prediction is to predict the future, and foresight is to anticipate at certain events which will help you succeed. And this is very important because every model is built to answer these things. For example, limits to growth is of course prediction, right? And you have 5 variables, and there is no question they're left, because it is assumed that they grow that way. Right? And if that growth is from the data, then it's okay in their own domain. Right? And they did not want to get the insight into the global system as such. Right? Now, of course, I was extremely impressed with that book. As much as in the book there is no more singing in spring. Forgot the name.
Rachel Carson, Silent
Yeah,
Spring.
right. Because that says that thing, right? In her own way. And what this first model tried to do, and rightly so, in their own way, right? To assume growth and through where they will cross. And if whoever control reality, like God or whatnot, follow this, then that will happen. Right? And it is based on certain assessment of the past. Still, right? This is population this way, and so on, and so on. But of course, they change, and in many different ways. For example, right now it is estimated that I don't remember whether in 20 years or so there will be more people older than 60 in China than entire European population at that time. Right? So it's not just a line. Right? There is more to it. And that is, of course, then a step toward being more specific. And that is what we try to do in our effort of the Mankind Turning Point. And I should say that this is injustice, but it happens all the time. It's called Masarovich-Pastel model. Actually, it's Barry Hughes model as well. And even more so, because he was working, he developed his own, of course, but he joined us, right? So even at that time, right, you get sort of fame or be criticized, whatever. But it is very Hughes as well, and that is from his book. He says from undifferentiated growth to organic growth, and I'm going to talk about this. And there is a quotation here. The world has a cancer, and the cancer is man. So don't forget cancer, right? If you are going to talk about world and so on. And so you have to have human dimension, not just variables which represent regions and groups and so on. And then graphs and graphs and graphs and graphs. And I will just show one how three of us, the beginners, keep saying three, look into to make the next step, right? Because the first is prediction. Remember this curve, forecast. We try to approach this as a foresight. Right? First of all, to have a model which can be used to check alternatives, not just 5 curves. Then this is the structure of this perspective that we started. First of all, there is multi-levelless, key in complexity is multilateralism, right? Whether you're talking about the body or whatever, there are different levels. And we recognize individual stratum level, group stratum level, demographic, economic stratum, technology and environment. So these are the 5 levels. For each one of these 5 levels, we build a model, right?
Which one, like?
But don't forget human, because it is human which is cancer, right? And then you look into this whole thing, and you have a portion which is human, meaning decision-making scenarios and so on, and the rest is causal model. In a sense, similar to Magnetonic point, right? But in more details, right? But you cannot have to describe the world without taking into account human as such. I have a picture here, which I don't know exactly where it is. For example, you, instead of running the model, right? You run the model for 1 or 2 or 5 years. Then you stop. Then you think. Then you talk. I have a picture here of a guy sitting in the corner, and he said, we ask him, right? In other words, you don't run the model, you go stepwise and try to get the insight to this process. And that was important for us, not only in education, but in particular in application. Much later on, I had here and also a letter describing the event I wanted to mention here. I'll just mention it here. Eliot Richardson, who was a good friend of mine, he was in Massachusetts, a Republican, I was a Democrat. And when I say friend, of course, there is a difference because he was higher and older, recognized and so on. But since we have mutual relationships of appropriate kind, he was senior and key person, I was just a professor, always a professor. And then one Friday afternoon, let me change. We have been asked, and we did install Barry Hughes and then Costello, my model, into a Joint Chief of Staff, right? And we trained them, and they were using it. They played their own games, one day, 5 years, next day, just 1 year, and so on. And one Friday afternoon, they called me. I had clearance to go there. I went there and said, "Desperate, Mike, we need a report on the blockade of Iraq for Tuesday briefing to the president, and we cannot produce it because we have to have approval from the higher level and higher level and higher level. And that cannot be done that Tuesday. You are independent, you write whatever you think it's right. So I spent the time to do it, and it reached the president's desk on Tuesday. And there is a letter from Elliot Richard to Senator Nunn, I think it's also there, in which he said,
Yes, yeah.
in which, yeah. Can you read this?
Oh, that's from Mitterrand.
All right. Anyway, it's here. He was saying to Senator Nunn just this story. He was telling to Senator, he was head, of course, of military things, government. He described what happened on that Tuesday, right? And that he should be aware of this. And of course that pleases me enormously because it's a historical event. And frankly, I was not for invasion. But in my report I said blockade is unfit to work. It doesn't mean he should invade, right? But I had to say what I thought. So in a sense, Berenice and my mother, right, play historical role at that point in time. And I think now one can have access to what happened at that meeting because of information release and so on. In one of these years, while I'm still around, I might try to see just for fun whether president that has impact really on the president. But he has this on his desk as our assessment of impact in blockading Iraq and so on. This is a Command and Control Technical Center, which is a thick volume describing the model, which they were trained to use, and so on. Command and Control Technical Center, 1979, and here is the description, the purpose of the world integrity model, composition, basic methodology, model construction, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that is just a tool, right? You know, this little guy in the corner, right? They were this guy here, right? And they had three actually things to consider. One is what are the norms for decision to, they are representing decisions of individuals or office. What are the norms? What is decision process? And what are the scenarios? Right? Scenarios are, of course, result of looking at this decision process, and then this is being put into the model. Then model is run, and then spend 1 year on or 1 week to figure out whatever, and then the next, and next, and next. It's not a line, it's yours already. And then there are details like population, economic, and trade, and payment, material model, and whatever you still. But the key is that human is inside the model, is a part of the model. In other words, he gets and looks at what model says up to that point in time, and then he or she or they represent what is being decided to do, right? And this is then implemented for the next step. So it takes you a week or almost a month or whatever to do this, or maybe just a couple of hours. So that again, this was installed in 1979 and later used for a number of years, and description is here, executive summary, basic methodology, and all these kind of things. But ultimately, it is not the model which forecasts, right? It is model which is guided. And it is not guided in foresight, right? It is guided by insight, but you provide the insight in the model as such. Again, it is hierarchical multi-level because multi-levelness is the key for any complex system, almost by definition, right?
And you want to talk also about being scientific advisor to Frederic Mayor,
Yes.
where UNESCO used so
Yes.
much of the...
Right, this will come next. So, anyway, this is again, say behavior, how the system evolves in time, functioning mechanisms which make the system behave as it does, organizing principles which are the laws that govern the system. That is the key. And that is what you are doing, not only in modeling growth, but in biology as well. And that's what I did 10 or 15 years after that point in time by introducing a multi-level systems biology. In other words, recognize the levels, trying to find the organizing principles for cancer. Right? Behavior and functioning and what is the unorganizing principles. Organizing principles just are elements of constitutions. For example, one organizing principle which we used also in to this John Chief of Staff in the biology and so on, organizing principle is relationship between the levels. What is the organizing principle for relationship between the levels? And again, talking with another friend, Herbert Simon, who was my neighbor at Pittsburgh, we are very good terms and vacation families together. And the only thing which he sort of complained about, he says, why you are using mathematics? But the Einstein said, rigor is needed to eliminate alternatives, right? So that you know not what will happen, but this alternative will not happen. So rigor is important as mathematics as such. Once you formalize your organizing principle. So boundary autonomy of level organizing principle, which I introduced in biology, is actually Herbert Simon bounded rationality, for which he received the Nobel Prize, right? In which another politician, a friend of mine, George Soros, who wrote the book which he gave to me, From One Genius to Another, when himself being a genius, he also used this intuition, right? Forcing pound to change and so on. And why? Because he invested at that time in Finland. Finland, value of the company in Finland at that time was larger than the whole GNP of Finland. Right? And after that, later he bought Vietnam. He was born in Hungary, not far from where I was born, and later on we get put together until what happened in Serbia. He would talk to me after that as if I had done it. It's true.
It was all your fault.
Well, you're right. But he was talking about the intuition, and he studied, and he knows the culture and everything else, and invested money in that. So then to come back to multi-levelness, I introduced organizing principle between the levels, which is bounded autonomy. In other words, levels do not interact like Newtonian mechanics or in first model say. No, there is a range within which it doesn't matter. Right? You know, this is, if you like, turning point, right? Tipping point. Your temperature is within a range, and it's the end of the range, right? And that, of course, they discover this in cancer and so on. And this is accepted and recognized, but formalized, it is bounded autonomy of levels. In multi-levelness, it is not like Newtonian mechanics, right? There is a range on each level. And then within the range, you have harmony. Outside this, right, you have problem. Right? So the second organizing principle, which we use now, global modeling, and also is really our understanding from biology, and that is coordination, because higher level coordinate, right? And the famous book which came recently, talk about that point. And the book is called Music of Life by Demis Noble. He's professor at Oxford, very famous member of the Royal Society, and you name it. And he wrote the book, which I just mentioned, and again, being intellectual philosopher, he started the book with a story. Of course, later on, he was modeling art. But in this book, Music of Life, he was arguing very much against saying DNA determines who you are for the rest of your life. Right. This is not true. Right. And then he said that he was listening to the music and he started crying. And that is opening for that book. It's very, very readable, and of course, written by a guy who knows biology, and so he said, why I'm doing this? Not because reproduction is good, I mean the tones are all right, or the composition is given. I start crying because I remember when I first heard that music in my life. And then he argued that music of life describe body, right? Where you have all these levels and so on, rather than, and of course, he actually made experiments with the brain. And on one level, it's a change of voltage. On the lower level, it is current. And in his experiment, when you cut this voltage, on the lower level, the current stops, right? And the whole thing collapses. So it is this music of life. But in a sense, it is. So his conclusion is there is no conductor in performance, right? And I came a little bit away from this. I said, but they are performing. Conductor is not telling them to do that. It's keeping them within a range, right? In other words, if somebody's out, you say, listen, you better do that in whatever way. So what he argued and showed experimentally, modeling hard, that it is not DNA which will switch you to be sick, right? Rather, it is like performance. And I also related this to the quotation in Cleveland Orchestra, a performance of Hindemith music, in which the guy who wrote this description of the performance is Hindemith music is complex without being complicated. That was his genius, right? But there is no insistence that there is no conductor. And then I came, and I never wrote this paper. I just didn't have time or whatever, but I will, I should. Actually, this bounded autonomy level is conductor, right? Because it says what is good, what is not good, right? Just like conductor. So it is not that conductor doesn't exist. There is somebody who harmonizes all this, right? So you see, now all this is in Barry's and Edward in my model as relates to global analysis, global system analysis in its own. So,
And Mankind at the Turning Point is still available on Amazon.com, both original copies and some of the 22 different editions in different languages. So for all of you who haven't read it, it's a classic. Go to Amazon, Masarovich, and buy Mankind at the Turning Point.
yes, well, that some publishers are very generous, and another book which I had on system biology, this recently they put on internet, so that it be available, that it will never go out of print. Right? And then ask me what they should do with the royalties. And my alternative was that royalties for the poor countries, I waived that. The students of the poor countries. But that book of system biology, which I wrote, right, will never go out of print, right? And that is another way of get your things distributed and get known and so on.
Mike has put on the wall here the different 22 editions, and it's a very nice exhibit he's put here, and some letters that came back in different languages, and it has been in English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Danish, Finnish, Swedish, Polish, Dutch, Romanian, Japanese, Croatian, Farsi, Turkish, Arabic, and Korean.
Another sort of comment is when I was in Belgrade with my wife and a 1-year-old son, and I was under terrible pressure because I was very anti-regime without being anti, because I do not come from a rich family, and I was supposed to be part of communist trend. But because my mother was PR and so on, I never accepted the stipend, whatnot. And I was under pressure all the time because of that. And we were sitting for breakfast, my wife and my 1-year-old son. He's a letter from US, from MIT. And it says that I've been given a Sloan postdoctoral fellowship. Here I come. You can imagine, if you can imagine. And that is after I spent 1 year in Yugoslav army where I was trained to be officer, right? And everything else, right? And so I accepted. They had travel and gave me salary of assistant professor. And that's how I became red-blooded American. And that turned out to be, green card for
And his daughter was born in the United States.
She was born in Cambridge, and so on. So that is, in a sense, personal story, but it also indicates how this is all developed. And then I look into economy as finance and so on, and wrote a paper, a paradigm shift is needed to understand and face up to ever-evolving problematic. And that was based on Paul Krugman article, The Return of Depressed Economics, I should say book, in which he says the only important structural obstacle to world prosperity are doctrines that clutter the mind of man. And I took this seriously and introduced paradigm shift based on everything should be made as simple as possible, right? And that Earth is not flat, rather a system of systems. And then I introduced this multi-levelness in more specific way. I mean, it's nothing new, right? But finance and was a subsystem, just like production, right? And objective of finance, right, is to allocate resources for production. But they turn around and took financial system outside on the higher level, right? And then, of course, crisis appear. This is what Krugman referred to, but this is how I explain it. In other words, finance is fighting development, and originally, and still in the books, it is assumed to be one of the sectors to allocate finance for production and growth and employment. But it's separate, and that is one thing that should be recognized regionally and globally, and so on. So these are, then there are all kinds of structural changes in the model to represent this, which is just not necessary to describe. So there are models of different variety. There is a database and there is a control and support. These are three parts. And model is multi-level, recognizing that finance is controlling and so on. And also we recognize 10 regions at the time. because that is not a global war, as Putin is trying to show us. So remember, it's Germany and the rest of the world, right? But so you cannot talk about globe, right? I mean, ultimately, from the view of forecast, right, that is a globe because it's a global GDP, right? But otherwise you have, this is another picture which I already mentioned. You see, this is the process. Set of alternatives, make a step. Set of alternatives, you make a step. And it takes a month or so to run a model to finish it. This is human. This is human. This is decision support procedure. Is he optimizing or satisfying or not? This is computer model of things which happen because of these decisions, and these are levels which are presented. So that is how varies, and my model and perception is represented. And then what I would like also to mention is that, here is the letter from François Mitterrand. Mitterrand certifies the French Socialist Party organized in Paris next June, the 5th and 6th of June, a working meeting with some of the best economists in the world about the present crisis of the capitalist economy in the world. This meeting will be open to a large audience. It will be an opportunity of confrontation with the French and European political leaders. Without your presence, such a meeting would not be placed at the highest level of reflection, where I intend to situate it. Thus, I would be glad if you could accept our invitation and therefore help us to strengthen our analysis of the foreseeable, not forecast, evolution of this last quarter of the 20th century. If, as I hope, your answer, my assistant will contact you, and so on and so on and so on. Right? So I attended this meeting, organized, right, in which we discussed and so on, and I used the model on the side whenever I needed. But it's the question is why you are doing this. Who are your audience? Right? One is other scientists or administration, university to get increased delays, which actually the case is the other way around. Because you work on this, you are not so good. But anyway, our interest was to make a difference where we could, right? As I mentioned in the case of Mitterrand, in the case of President. And then we went to a number of other countries, in Iran, in Egypt, in Germany, in Venezuela, in Washington, in Algiers, in Jakarta, in Hawaii, in India, Austria, Finland, Senegal, Spain, Mexico, Moscow, and so on. Install the model, let them use, and so on, and sort of influence a little bit. Yes. And the second audience, of course, were educators, professors. And here is a letter from Federico Mayor, another friend of mine, and so on. I wish to thank you for your continuous keen interest in working with UNESCO in the area of natural social science education related to the global issues, and to express my appreciation of your willingness to provide me with your advice and support in this connection, which links together a number of universities in developed countries alike, represents an excellent means of providing your scientists and future decision makers with knowledge and skills needed to address complex global issues relevant to environment and sustainable development. In recognition for your outstanding qualification in this field and your unfailing dedication to this goal of UNESCO, I had the pleasure to invite you to become a UNESCO scientific advisor on global change issues. I hope that you will agree, accept, and so on and so on. So, I commute to Paris, which was not bad.
An offer you couldn't refuse.
No, I couldn't refuse, but he was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful man as such. And it was a pleasure working with him. And so we went to a number of universities, schools, and so on. And also they published some good books about what we were doing. I don't have it here. And so on. So then this is another aspect where you actually oriented our efforts. Was education and for professor and student and so on. Actually, very work with the European, what's called this institution?
Commission?
Right?
The commission?
The commission, right? And he was extremely successful. His model, not our model, he developed more appropriate model for purpose, is now being used, right? And in many instances which he's going to talk about. So our whole effort over these 20 years or more was not to become famous scientists, but rather, by the way, doing that too, just for fun, but trying to make a difference on whatever level, whoever will listen to what we're doing. And there are many other things and places and sources that we used, some of which are done by some of the people here. And this is from this is organized by James Speth, who was German. He asked me to talk with me and organized a meeting at the White Plantation. He asked me what he should talk about. And I say, global possible. Right. And he was German, and the governors were Russell Train, Sojit Moko, Robert Anderson, Maurice Strong, and McNamara, and the steering committee at White Plantation. We discussed global possible, and that was supposedly also part on given to the president when he was running for the second term in office. So, in addition to model as such, which is technical exercise, we, I say, my group, Larry and so on, really did effort and to make the difference in education, in decision making, scientists, in biology, and so on. Right? This wasn't without some reward. For example, I was maybe in 40 countries. Sometimes just 2 days or 3 days, but at least I was there for various reasons. Living in Paris for a year, and Charivert, owner of L'Express, right, devoted 1975 special issue to what we are doing. Right? Vivre demain. And then he took a artist to develop this painting. I think it's here somewhere.
It is.
Over there.
Right. And I have this, of course, at home. That was the painting, indicating that more money is spent on arms than on food, right? And of course, there is a lot of, the representation, the 10 regions which he used, and so on and so on and so on. And that is that used to be me, the guy with a lot of hair, right? And then the second is Maurice Leonie, who was a diplomat and my friend. And he just even had the courage to ask me to join him on the interview on French television, which he corrected my French for discussion and so on. So what I'm saying is this is another way that we try and were able to reach and advance interest in not only forecast but foresight, insight to whatever group of people we thought might use this whenever we can. And I have to say that maybe I mentioned this already, that if you are doing what you like to do, you will never work. And I don't think I work in my life because that was fun. Yeah, I had a friend in the Cleveland Museum, and he was Augustus for art, and he was sent once a year to Europe to buy new pieces for the museum. And one year he said, "Mike, why don't you go with me?" And I went to Nice and so on and so on. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. And again, I don't know how to respond to this. I had an office in L'Express, in secretary. She gave me. And I actually drove the car. And I went to England and drove on the right side for a month. Anyway, and I told the secretary, I apologized, I said, "I'm sorry, my French is so poor." And she said, "You should have a girlfriend and you'll learn better. But I'm not available." I didn't respond to that at all. But now I realize that they are for real. I thought it was a joke, but now you see that they are serious about that, right? Right. But anyway, I never learned French.
With that, I think we'll end the presentation. But we want to tell you that we, the USACOR, and I think I won't speak for KCOR,
Yeah.
and I won't speak for CORE because Sheila, I'll take thunder away from her, consider you a national treasure and one of our finest geniuses. We're a group of geniuses, but you're one of our, and you've given us this marvelous treasure, your model, which carried through by Barry, and we're terribly grateful. Before we have a brief discussion of
One more
thing.
one more event. About 2 months ago, came a young lady from Pittsburgh. She was being recruited for case in electrical engineering. And after the meetings, she mentioned the name and Miss Howard. She jumped and hugged me, right? And she apologized. I'm sorry that I'm so emotional. And I told her, it's famous scientist is like a beautiful lady. She knows she's beautiful, but she likes to hear it. So I told her not to be excited.
And
embarrassed that she hugged me, you know.
Here's another one of our genuine national treasures, Dana Raphael, who with Margaret Mead started the Human Lactation Center, and she understands tipping points
Yeah.
because women all over the world are now doing breastfeeding with doulas. And she is now on a subject which is of colossal change. She was on slavery a decade ago, but she's going to tell you where her meeting is in the, we're simultaneous with the women's meeting of the UN. So you say the room, and so Dr. Dana Raphael will.
Thank you. Is that room? I'm not sure, but it's in the, we have to ask, in the
Church Center.
Church Center, right. And it's 4 o'clock. Is it not 4? And do we have the room number?
It's the 10th floor.
10th floor.
10th floor.
10th floor.
And the name?
And we're, I'm not good at that. What did we name it?
It's about empowering women through institutionalized torture, dealing with victims of women who've been institutionally tortured.
Yes, but
Like in the Club of Rome.
yes, for the Club of Rome. Glad you said it.
I'm sorry, it's on tape.
Sorry, do come if you're interested at all in abuse. It's an extraordinary and fairly new concept that we're trying to open up. The concept of cults, small cults all over the world who have developed this terrible method, if you would say, of torturing children to get total control of them. And it's something that we want to bring forward. And one of the ways we're doing it is by presenting it at the Status of Women's Conference at the UN. It's open to the public, by the way, so anyone can access it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
She will be at lunch, so if you have any further questions, you can ask she or Jan.
Yeah.
And they have.
And I have a flyer if anyone's interested in the specifics.
Yes. All right, so I throw the floor open for a few questions, and then we're going to proceed to Barry Hughes, and then we'll have a more extensive questioning. So, yes, Sheila.
I'm glad, and that is your work has been with scientists and I assume many economists. And as an electrical engineer, how did you manage the interactions with, in particular, economists?
I learned. I became electrical engineer to support my family. I was interested in philosophy and mathematics. My sister was studying architecture, and she came home with Professor Kashan book of higher mathematics, and she was crying. She couldn't understand it. And I was in high school. It took me 2 weeks every night to understand it. and explained to her. And I was interested in philosophy, right? But there was only Marxist philosophy there. So, you can see this is how I really emerged. And as soon as I wrote the book in 1960 at MIT, that was the first thing multi-level control of engineering systems, right? And that book was published and so on. So I just gave up on engineering altogether. Right? With my wife sometimes complained, I don't know how to change the bulb. Because I was engineer because that is one thing which could be studied and use mathematics and so on. As soon as I came to the US, no more engineering. I mean, nothing wrong with engineering, but rather moving in the direction which I just described. So I had to learn and so on in order to satisfy my curiosity. And what the result was that my wife had to tolerate it because I was working so hard and studying and so on. And so of course she supported me. But that was it. That's the passion. As I say, I never worked. Right? Fortunately.
I think so that we don't get too far behind, we're going to go on with Professor Barry Hughes from the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver. Barry worked with Mike for some years, coming to Cleveland to have cooperative programs, and since then Barry has developed, and you will hear about this, several important later models of this same mankind at the turning point. But I will leave that to Barry, and the outreach of Barry is really part of the whole outreach of the mankind, and that's what we're here today to examine, the outreach through the things Tapio's talking about at the UN and through Barry at the UN and other places like EU. And of course, we won't forget the USACOR book, which outreach to many countries in Latin America, because this has been presented to Congress and to 50 countries in Latin America. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nature. Actually, more generally, on behalf maybe of not just myself, but others around here, thank you for organizing this. It's a fantastic pleasure to be here and to celebrate this moment and to celebrate life.
As I mentioned, like beautiful women, I am very happy to be recognized.
So again, thank you. And I'm not going to talk. So I wasn't planning to talk so much about what our work is at this point and what we've done. I want to focus really on mankind and what Mike has done. But let me draw your attention to our logo in the bottom left there. That logo stands as meant to be capital I, capital F, small s, IFS, which is the name of our computer simulation, International Futures. And it's all about alternative scenarios, alternative futures, and how we can gain insight and shape futures. But anybody who has a little mathematical background will recognize the middle line there as an S-curve, which has, of course, a turning point. And that is a reflection clear back to when we first met and the work on this book. I still remember that meeting, like 42 years ago. You probably don't, but John Richardson organized it. We sat down over lunch at the faculty club at Case Western Reserve University, and John introduced us, and that was the beginning of 42 years of interaction in one way or another. Anyway, what I want to talk about is Mike. I'll mention Mike's influence on me a little bit more, but I want to talk about the book, The Model of the Future. And that is a copy of the book that shows a little age, which is like the copy on my shelves, because it's been well worn. Several generations of students have used that book. I put it on reserve in the library. I've taught from it, and that book has been a terribly important influence on lots and lots of people. In terms of Mike's influence on me, Mike, I want to thank you for, you opened so many doors to the world. I mean, you mentioned travels in 40 countries. At least I had a share in some of those countries. You took us to Germany, to France, to Iran, to Egypt, to Venezuela, to Mexico, to Senegal. I don't know how many other countries, and it was a wonderful opportunity. You also shaped my views of the world, and I'll talk more about that, because like the logo, I mean, your influence is all over my own work, and perhaps outside of my own parents. I don't think there's anybody who has shaped my life the way you have. And I am very grateful for that, because I think most of that shaping, maybe not all of it, but most of it has been very good. I work more than you do, apparently. I'm sitting and slaving over computer code. I think it's work sometimes. I won't say it's all pleasure, but the shaping of what I do has been mostly pleasurable and mostly beneficial. In the book, 18 languages, you've already seen that, over 500,000 copies apparently. And there are some themes in that book that are terribly important. One of them was organic growth, which you did not mention in any detail, but I have come to think of organic growth in a way as a foundation for what is now called sustainable growth. It's an interaction of many things together in an organic and sustainable fashion. And sustainability was not a concept that was used a lot back then. But organic growth in some ways is more meaningful, I think, than even sustainable growth can be, because it suggests this organizing complexity. It suggests these bringing systems together. And that book put that concept forward front and center. The book also put forward the front and center the need for multi-regional. And Mike has already mentioned we started with 10 regions, and I think we went on to 14 at some point. Multi-issue. Long-term analysis. And I think the book was first in many of these areas. I mean, the Limits to Growth book, as you said, was a small number of equations, a small number of variables in interaction. Terribly important in helping us understand conceptually the limits to growth, how things, exponential processes cannot continue forever. There has to be a turning point. And what you did is take those small number of equations in different issue areas, and you and your team, and my name should not be in the same, you've been very generous in putting my name out there, but it's you in overwhelmingly, along with Edward, who built that system with a team of us who supported it. And what that team developed was the first representation of the world with multiple systems, a system of systems, system of models, in interaction, looking long term, that could actually be used with intervention and questioning for alternative analyses and alternative scenarios. It was a first in all kinds of important ways. Now, things I struggled with a little bit more as I worked with you back in Cleveland for those roughly 8 years, or 9 years we overlapped there. I had more trouble at that time with the multi-level hierarchical systems, which you had written the book, a classic book at this point, and it is it's something that I had more trouble understanding, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I think I've come to understand it better over time. And I had more trouble at the time also thinking of it as a decision tool as opposed to a thinking tool, as opposed to an exploration tool. And I'll come back to that a little bit more also. But with respect to the multi-level or multiple systems, this is the way I have come to understand it over the intervening years.
Yeah.
I think the agenda that we all face in this room and in this world really consists of three interacting systems and agendas. And these don't correspond exactly to your levels, but they're very close. Human development.
Yeah.
We are trying to reduce poverty and hunger. We're trying to advance education and health. Human development is fundamental. Social development. We're trying to reduce conflict. We're trying to reduce inequality. We're trying to advance governance capacity, social capacity, and the inclusiveness of our governance and social systems. And then sustainable development. Reducing the unsustainable use of resources and protecting the environment. Now those three agendas are interactive. You can't have one without the other. And the more I have come to think about it over the years, the more I have come to actually agree with the fact that you made these multi-level and hierarchical and you put human development at the top. Because unless you have advances in education and health, unless you advance the human condition, we're not going to have social development and we're not going to have sustainable development. So in reality, that hierarchical structure that you built has finally, I'm a slow learner. It's taken me quite a few years, but I've finally begun to realize that you are exactly right. And it just took me a long time to catch on to it and frame it in my own way, but see it also in your way. Now, that takes me to the system of systems, because what we were trying to develop then, and the world is continuing to build on this, what we were trying to do at that time is we were trying to represent, for instance, the modern faith. Because population, people are the center of this, as you just said a number of times in your remarks. People are the center of it. And in the world integrated model, or the Masarykovich-Pastel model, it had a very significant representation of population. It was one of the best developed submodels, I think, within that system. It took UN data, the data from right around the corner practically over, and it developed what is called a cohort component model of age categories, males and females divided, and it was one of the first models of that kind that was really truly available, and well done. You asked Sheila about economics and dealing with economists, and I'll say that sometimes they have been bane of our existence. I'll say it more directly than Mike did, but we have learned, as he said, from them, and we have had to develop an economic models, and back then we were doing fairly simple economic modeling, in part because the data weren't available. And one of the things I want to emphasize, and I think this goes back to what Anitra said at the very beginning, this was in the 1970s. And you think about the data that were available to us back in those years. Most of African states had only been independent for about 10 years. The United Nations bodies that collected data more recently had practically no data on those African countries, and very little data on many of the South Asian and other countries around the world. We struggled in all of these areas, and we did a remarkably good job, I think, of pulling together data and representations also of the economy. We actually developed, I think, back in that system, one of the best, the first models of education that was out there. We were forecasting. We knew that human development was critical, and we developed a representation of education, which we made some further progress in the intervening years, but that was foundational. We knew health was important, but health data were really not available to us. Maybe we could get life expectancy, but things like the Global Burden of Disease Project from the World Health Organization, those weren't even a gleam in anybody's eye back then. So we did not have the health data that we needed, but we know that was part of what we needed to do. We haven't talked about infrastructure. Infrastructure was not part of our system back then in any real way. Access to water and sanitation, these are things that we understand to be important. Domestic governance, we had very limited representation of that, but we had some of the early representation of it. International political systems, energy system, we actually have, and this is one area I did make some contribution to back in those days, was representation of energy forecasting. We had a representation of food and agriculture and land use. They weren't there. I remember still going to the World Bank and presenting some of our forecasting in this area. They didn't have anything like that, and they were a bit skeptical sometimes about what we did. But when we got them to sit down and look at it, they knew we had made some real progress. Technology, the environment, those are all systems that we knew to be important, and the interaction across all those systems. This agenda that Mike and Edward and the team had back in those days is still the agenda we're building on today. This actually comes from the work that we are doing now with International Futures, and this is so closely tied to those foundations that we've had to change very little in terms of our conceptualization, even if it's taken me a while to learn about multi-level harmonical systems. Now, let's put the world integrated model in context. You all know about global modeling or world modeling because the global world has been so closely associated with that. And the Forrester Meadows work, World 3, was in some ways the first world model. Was there any earlier model, Mike? Was there any earlier world model really than World 3?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. I think it was the very first.
Yes.
And within 2 years of that, you had put together a team and had developed the World Integrated Model, the Sarvich-Pastel model, which also had other names and other manifestations. You mentioned work, for instance, with the Defense Department. I think that work, I think the version was called GlobeSight. But all of these came and built on that foundation. And then there have been others that we interacted with and that built their own systems. There was one in Latin America called Sarum. There was one in Japan called Fuji, and there were a few others. These were the foundational elements, and really WIM, the World Integrated Model, the Sarvich-Pastel model, broke the ground of moving from the simplicity of World 3 to the complexity that I just showed you. And now there are others out there, including one in the Netherlands called Gizmo, which is not well known, and the International Futures model that I work on. But this is the tradition here. Now, there's another tradition that has begun and goes back a ways, and it's increasingly, we need to back up. It's increasingly known as integrated assessment models. Integrated assessment models have grown up primarily in the environmental area, the climate change area, they are not complete models. They don't have the human development. They don't have the social development. They're primarily on the physical side that I showed you earlier: energy, agriculture, the environment, there is in IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, a suite of models that are not integrated anywhere near as well and as fully as the work we did even 30, 40 years ago. But actually, we influenced that work because Mike organized one of the presentations of our work, of the Sarvich-Pastel, the World Integrated Model, at Luxembourg. I still remember that. And we rolled that out over several days, and we helped IIASA really lay their own foundations for what came after that. There have been projects in the Netherlands, including in Utrecht, that have picked up on that, and they also work within this integrated assessment tradition. And there's ongoing IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change work, which works on, the IPCC people are full of initials and acronyms, and you need a dictionary to understand what they do. But they talk about RCPs, which means relative concentration pathways for greenhouse emissions. And they're beginning, just within the last 3 or 4 years, to talk about what they call SSPs, which is shared socioeconomic pathways. Because they're beginning to recognize that if you don't connect that with the socio side and the economic side, they're not going to be able to deal with the issues of mitigation and adaptation on climate change. So there's a tradition over there that has developed kind of away from our tradition of the world models. But there's a coming synthesis, and it's just beginning, and we can begin to see it. And that will take us to what I was talking about before, human, social, and sustainable development together. And the sustainable development will not just be focused on climate change. As Anitra and I were talking about over dinner, there's a set of sustainability issues that everybody around this table is very much aware of. And climate change is one of them. And species loss, including fisheries, overuse of water, including the rundown of aquifers. All of these things, which are largely ignored in much of the integrated assessment modeling, need to be picked up and brought into this. So I expect that this tradition is going to not only bring together the world models with the socio-political, the human development side, with the environmental and sustainability side, but I think it will broaden the sustainability side into these other issues, and we can anticipate this synthesis. And I think the synthesis will look something more like this. First of all, it has to have data foundations, and strong data foundations. And I want to emphasize again how difficult it was for us back there. I remember getting these big books of numbers in hard copy form, and we would pick those out and transcribe them and punch them into what were called IBM cards, Hollerith cards. And our first computer used Hollerith cards. I mean, we didn't have anything. This was a dream we didn't even have at that time. But we used these Hollerith cards and we ran them through, and then you managed to put things together, and we bought a computer. You bought a computer with these big cathode ray tubes, and we sat and worked on those night after night after night, and putting all this all together. But the data were extremely difficult to get. And now, finally, we're beginning to get data out there in a fashion that I think is importable. What we're trying to do right now is we're trying to semi-automate some of the import. For instance, the World Development Indicators, the World Max World Development Indicators, only about 2 or 3 years ago, they recognized that rather than putting this out and selling it on CDs, they should put it on the web and give it away. Yeah, exactly. And what we need to do now is we need to be able to pull from those databases semi-automatically and put them into the database that we use as the foundation of our model. And that's beginning to happen. We need, in terms of the formulations of the model, what I think is terribly important are things like transparency and openness. If the model is a black box, it's useless.
You have to explain simply. You cannot explain simply. You don't understand.
If it's a magic box and people are supposed to accept the answer, people are not in the box. People are not part of the model. So transparency is fundamentally important, and it's very difficult to achieve with models. But we are increasingly able to do it because we have the computer tools. We're able to build the help systems. We're able to link the models to the explanations of what's inside it, and that is moving forward. We also need, I think, openness in all of these models. We need them to be available for other people to use. And Anitra, you were kind enough to point out that we were able to be open with our system and make it possible for your team to use. And that is fundamentally important. WIM, by the way, is still out there online. World Integrated Model. Peter Brekke, as a result really of Tapio's influence early on in his efforts to collect these models and to maintain them and make them available. Peter Brekke, I contacted last week, and he sent me a copy of the World Integrated Model. It's still available. I didn't try running it. And one of the reasons I didn't try running it is because the user interface was extremely crude. I mean, we would sit there and there would be a cursor blinking. And if you didn't know how to use that model, it was a very difficult system. Now, of course, we have Windows-like interfaces, and we're able to intervene fairly easily. And the user-friendly part of that over there is an important part of it. We're able to build alternative scenarios and run them in a fairly systematic way. I skipped over the institutionalization. my own thinking is that these models will increasingly become, I mean, you all know the expression crowdsourcing, getting information from the crowd out there and collective thinking and collective understanding and insight into problems. I think modeling will never be exactly crowdsourcing, but I think we will move towards libraries of modules, the system of systems. We will move towards the ability to say, I want to take the fertility function that I've developed and put it into this larger system and see how it interacts with it. And I believe that we're going to be, within 5 years, able to do that. We'll be able to put up a system of systems on the web and swap in new modules and patch them together. It's a very difficult thing to do, and we're going to need your help, I think, in terms of the organizing principles. But that is where we should be going. Now, we're also going to need strategy search tools, because this is where the human comes in. We need them iteratively. We need to be able to interact with the model, ask what-if questions, stop the model after 5 years, interact with it, continue. But we also need more automated search tools for strategies. We're asked all the time, how can I achieve X, and what are the ways that the model helps me understand how to achieve X? And those are very difficult things to develop, but we need that also. I think we need models that are open and free, and that's part of the transparency. They need to be on the web, and they need to be just usable for anybody who wants to go on and get at them. Now, all of those things up there are going beyond what World Integrated Model and Sartre Pesto, but all of them are in ways inherent in what was started back then. So I think that the foundations that you laid, Mike, are still playing out, and we're still building on them in many ways. So that actually is the end of my presentation in terms of formal presentation. I've still got some, no, I don't have any time.
Go ahead, say
I would like to say that if anybody wants to, they can go on the web and they can find this International Futures Model. And I actually brought also, a couple of flash drives with the model on it. There's a version that's open and free on the web, and then there's the version that can be downloaded, and it's still loading some files in. But this is, in many important respects, the continuation of what
It's a great
we
step.
had 40 years ago. The reason that it's taking so long to load files is I was yesterday at the United Nations Development Program, the Human Development Report Office, and its report, the last 3 reports have used the International Futures System. And we now represent any country in the world. So if you're interested in looking at China, for instance, you can go in here and you can click on this, and you can see the age, sex distribution of China, but you can also see that broken down by educational level. Or we can look at the health, we can look at the mortality patterns, we can advance this over time from 2010 to 2015, continue back. There's a database in here, we can do longitudinal and cross-sectional analysis, and we've got 2,500 data series that we're pulling in increasingly in this automated way. So all of this is part of the extension, the continuation. And our website, by the way, is, I think, clear and important credit to the World Integrated Model. We've always tried to maintain that. So I'm going to put at that point.
Can you just say the URL again for the website?
I'm sorry?
Could you give us the URL for the website?
Yes,
I know you had it at the beginning.
Let me go back to the.
On behalf of Marilyn, she wants to know whether she can come and film you and you would talk to her students in her distance learning, right?
Exactly.
Isn't that the base question here?
I was looking at it for junior high and high school students and how we could distill this information in a way that they could understand it and use it.
You're welcome to come at any time and sit, in our conference room, we've got 2 large screens, and we'll sit there and we'll show you how the model works, and then you can make it available to anybody at any level. If you go, for instance, the model is not only online at these, oops, that's the wrong one, that's my human development. Let's go to a different one here. Let's go to Mankind, the Turning Point. Here's the URL, pardee.bu.edu. Go to that. And then in the upper left-hand corner, there will be a Use Ifs button that you can click on and go to the web-based version of the system. Okay, but very much a continuation.
I think we're out of time, and rather than have, yes.
I just want to make 2 more comments. How does it feel to be 85 and become more beautiful every hour? And the second is, if I ever get depressed, I'll give you a door.
When I get depressed, I take Google Earth and I go down to all the places around the world I have restored, and I can see them clearly from Google Earth, and it makes me feel much better that day. It sustains me. Our next speaker is Tapio Kanninen from Finland originally, but he has been here in New York at the United Nations, before that in Norway at the United Nations. He was the chief of the Policy Planning Unit in the United Nations Department of Political Affairs, which is under the Secretary General. Head of the Secretariat of Kofi Annan's 5 summits with regional organizations, and presently a senior fellow and co-director and project of sustainable global governance at the Ralph Bunche Institute at the City University of New York. Tapio is a member of the International Club of Rome and a member of our USA Club, and he's going to talk about mankind at the turning point from the vantage of having used it earlier and having some ideas about usability in the UN system now. Thank you, Tapio.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and it's really good to my consultants. And this is overview of my talk. I have had a project with Mike Messerowitz at the UN in early 1990s to support climate change negotiations, and I'm giving a little brief account what we had in mind at the time. I just went to my archives and found all the papers and correspondence we had. And then I go to the evaluation of the Mankind book. And then I have some proposals, which we also worked together in the different contexts with Barry, and I'm coming to that in a moment. Now, first as background, there was a UN Office for Research and Collection of Information, ORS. It was established in 1988, and it was a part of the political offices of the UN Secretary General. I was in the design team, and I did my PhD dissertation on that. It's called Leadership and Reform now. And it has a mandate to monitor and assess global trends, and I was involved in that. And in our team, there was a kind of reform team. In 1988, there was a Canadian called, whose name was Carl Pedersen, and he was in the UN Director General's office. It was the UN Director General of Development and Economic Affairs, I think. And now it's called Deputy Secretary General with a little different functions. And before the Secretariat was established for this convention of framework convention on climate change. Carl Pedersen was given a task to organize its first meeting of International Negotiation Committee was in Washington DC. It was for 14th of February 1991. And so I had a number of meetings with Mike at the UN, and we saw a clear opportunity here. Here is a guy who is organizing what later came a convention and all the rest out of that. And I actually mentioned something about my own interest. No, I'll come later to that. No. So it was decided that Mike would make a presentation to the delegations who were gathered there. There were like 2 weeks discussions, and during the weekend he did this and presented his system. And maybe 2 years before, Dan Neihart from MIT had visited me in Orsi at the UN, and there is this account of how this kind of modeling system helped the law of the sea negotiations before. And Elliot Richardson had evidently been a US law of the sea representative and was quite impressed by this, how model helped the modeling system helped to get the consensus. And the presentation was quite successful. There was a quite good attendance. It was really decided to continue. Richardson, Orsi, Director General's office, and many delegations gave strong support for this idea. But then we were not really successful, and I come to that. So Mike presented this negotiation support system, NEGOS, which was evidently at that time the latest version of computer-aided system for negotiations. And it was quite convincing and well received. And it was thought that it could be useful in evaluating various negotiating positions and their implications, and thus it would reduce the scope and the issues to be negotiated and the time needed for any consensus to manageable proportions. And the vice chairman, who was at the same time rapporteur of the committee, the negotiation committee, told me this. It is quite essential that all delegates would have available this kind of support system during the negotiation process. So there was a kind of window of opportunity here, and the Director General and his office, Carl Pedersen, sent letters to all major intergovernmental players proposing support for this kind of service. But I believe Hitachi Foundation was interested, UNESCO was interested, and maybe only Mike knows what happened. Why it didn't start? We were very happy to start, very enthusiastic to do it, but evidently the fundraising was a problem. Anyways, my background for evaluating the Mankind book is that I had made my master's thesis on economics on Limits of Crowding already 1972 in Helsinki University. I met Dennis Meadows in 1992 in Costa Rica in the University for Peace, and I asked the question, how is the world doing? And he said, nothing has really been done in terms of avoiding the dangers which Limits of Crowd presented. And this led to the finally, when I left the UN, to the completing of book Crisis of Global Sustainability.
I use it.
What?
I use it in some of my work.
Okay.
Oh yeah. You know, for human dimension.
Right. And so I worked a year on this. I gathered all kind of information for various places. So I'm a little bit doing now this evaluation based on what I thought was like 60 conclusions, observations, or recommendations, which I kind of found in the epilogue of the book. And that's just my interpretation. and it's based on what has happened between 1974 to 2014. And this all will show that this mankind at the turning point really covered a lot of ground, concepts and issues, and they are as valid, or maybe 95% of them as they were at that time. First point, Messerowitz and Beste are saying global crises are not temporary. Yes, we have continuous crises in all these areas, but there are also new threats, and that's the interconnected crisis, the interwired, because the versus of interwired financial crisis, maybe was a regression or a signal of that throughout, and the Arab Spring is a good example probably. And then there's a new threats like global warming, and I would say also the carbon bubble, that we can only like 20% of the known fossil reserves if we want to stay within the 2 Celsius grade compared to the prehistoric time. But when this is realized, what would happen to the oil companies, for instance? Would they come crashing down? So that's something which is coming. The second global effort necessary to solve the turning point crisis. I don't see any such real global effort right now. I think the UN is fragmented, mostly powerless. UN Secretary General is dealing, yes, with the climate change, but it's concentrating, has to, many issues, and integrated planning is missing. And I know this quite well because I worked in these areas at the UN for 30 years. Regional organizations, G7, 8, might be G7 soon. G20 are not that powerful, are not powerful enough. Club of Rome, to mention one, is not powerful, and I don't think it's as vocal as it should, and it's not really operational. World Economic Forum, I would say it's mostly a high-level forum for networking. And so the question is, do we need something more? Need a holistic approach. I would say integrated analysis and projections, connecting economic, environmental, social, political, with power to have impact globally and regionally is missing. So again, do we need something new? So again, Messerowitz and Beste are saying cooperation framework is necessary away from confrontation and conflict. There have been quite a lot of efforts to mediate political conflicts. I used to be in the political side of the UN, like the UN envoys, Carter's and Martiati Service Crisis Management Initiative, elders, and there are some results. So Uppsala University graphic shows that there are some results. But what we really need is the UN climate change, some kind of a mediator or facilitator for UN climate change talks, because there are not really results in the most critical coming out of that. So that is the real big problem. Towards organic growth, which Barry also mentioned, I'm just taking up here this measurement side. So I used to also work at the statistical office in Finland, working with cross-national product. And now I think the global ecological footprint is really showing that we have a big Ponzi scheme in terms of using the resources. And there are many other comprehensive measurement systems, but they are not really widely used. Need for long-term thinking. Barry also mentioned IPCC, but the problem is that they are just in one area, and we have these global models, later generation world models, and international futures, and these booklet publications like this Anitra's book on future in the Western Hemisphere. But the long-term thinking and statistics and projections are not enough. There is a need for connecting scenarios directly to decision making. Seventh point, practical procedures for comprehensive solutions. solutions are usually ad hoc and done by area specialists, no integration between different fields. We might need a new organization, and let's go to the recommendations later. From Cold War polarization or joint solutions of forced joint solutions of long-term problems, I think we are far from fulfilling this goal. All the military blocks, which were still very key in 1974, and are not that important as before. UN Security Council has discussed climate change and other long-term threats, but there are some strong opposition from some members like China and Russia. Apart from the UN, G8, G20, Davos have been forums or meeting across blocks, but again, long-term thinking connected with actions is largely missed. Now, new global ethics, sustainability, as Barry also mentioned, has been increased, and I also see sort of linkage to this organic growth, but it's not really used as a totally new paradigm for thinking and action. I rather think as, and here I'm a little bit parting away from Barry's thinking that human development is key. I think the paradigm has totally changed, that the survivability of the human race and globe should be the foundation, a new paradigm for all of us. And not many people are really talking too much about this. James Hansen is a climate scientist who is talking for building disruption book, and my friend Ian Nullock from Brown is really very forcefully talking about that. Ethical use of natural resources. There are some initiatives like Global Compact and Caring for Climate at the UN, and I think the business world and research community also have some goals on these issues. 12, identification with future generations, and I think James Hansen's book, Stories of My Grandchildren, is a good example of how he sees, and his TED Talks, TED Talk also 2 years ago, it started with his pictures of his grandchildren, so it's a really moving way to start something. And then there's this movement for intergenerational justice and even an organization for that. Strengthen outer limits, concept respect for nature. I think I would mention the planetary boundaries concept. The Stockholm Resilience Center has been promoting, Johan Rockström and maybe 20 scientists published in 2009 this famous article. UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability has promoted this boundary concept, but also the tipping points, which is very powerful concept, and some 15 tipping points has been identified, and it's a fascinating but scary science, because it might show that we are going beyond the limit very soon, or maybe we have gone. 14, the strategy to counter inner limits and organizational limits. The inner limits are the values, the organizational limit, and that's something which it might be a PhD and a book on UN reforms. And I spent there almost 30 years, and I don't say this lightly, but I think that the UN does not work.
That's from the inside.
And that is really, and a clear sign of this is this carbon dioxide emissions. We have tried 20 years to do something, and nothing has happened. So next one is the achieve balance between regions. I was the secretary of some 7 years of these summits with Kofi Annan and no, actually Boutros Ghali started this in '94, but they have been just in a very limited area. Of course, the UN system tries to to do a lot of work on this, but the results are mixed. Now, this is the recommendations at the end of the book. Design global anticipatory and adjustment procedures, mechanisms and instruments, and this is the topic of my recommendations. So I think it's important to continue the tradition of mankind using these work models or integrated assessment models. And I have 3 recommendations. First, first one with the 3 components. And I organized a panel in New Orleans 2010, and Barry was there, and Peter Brecker, who by the way we recruited him here from MIT to set up a computer system for this Office of Research and Collection of Information in 1988. And now we kind of met again with Barry, and they have worked together, I guess, in Berlin. And what I'm presenting came out of our meeting, and it needs some updating by Barry, and I think it might also by Peter. And the first was that we should organize a symposium on policy relevant modeling of global sustainability, state of the art and the future. And the participants could come from such organizations as GISMO, which you mentioned, Dutch Ministry of Health and Environment, IASA Modeling Group, Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and your own group, Barry, from Denver. And the idea would be to review the present status, plans, options, strengths and weaknesses, and compatibility of the most advanced modeling projects. And to what extent the international community have already tools available and should have tools available. And this would be in all areas of global sustainability. And should be some 20-25 participants, scholars of course, modeling experts, but very important is to have some practitioners, present and future, or people who have access to the decision makers and in all these areas. And then the symposium could recommend that present groups combine their strengths in some areas, or that maybe a totally new effort should be initiated. And I come to that, and then the publication, action plan, and maybe a report to the public role. So this is could be one specific recommendation. Project modeling that one of the existing modeling groups would be chosen to develop a powerful new or adapted or extended modeling tool to present the key variables of global sustainability. And at the time, Barry was saying that only GISMO and IFs would have capacity to do this in 2 years. So it was kind of a full-time work. I don't know what is the situation right now. And then the third idea was the lecture series that Global Forum or its chapters could invite relevant modeling groups, planners of such groups to give presentations, and then a short paper, 10-20 pages, and then after some 6 to 12 presentations, the most promising ones could be invited to a Global Forum sponsored conference, and some further work on that. Now, I think that we need, in principle, to establish some kind of center connecting decision making and modeling. And in my book, I was thinking about that, and we have had some seminars on that. That it should be close to decision makers, such as the UN, so it could be in New York, and it could do kind of basic research, but then also give confidential advice to decision makers. It could mediate some things, organize brainstorming for practitioners, but still be independent from the UN or governments, financially and politically. And I have 2 organizational models already. One is International Peace Institute in the political area in New York, and I was running the policy planning unit at the UN. I was using their brainstorming capacity, research capacity, etc. quite a lot. And UN Secretary General is chairman of the honorary chair of the board. And then in the US we have National Intelligence Council, and it has used Paris model also. And it's doing these kind of things, giving advice to the president and doing research, confidential advice, but also then battle reports where Paris has been involved. And this is elaborated in my book. I have already kind of job descriptions and all that. And then finally, when I raising the question that do the UNFCCC negotiations in Paris need help? It's a critical conference. The future of the mankind will be decided there. When after the Rio conference, this UNFCCC was signed, we have not got anywhere in terms of really important issues in the negotiations. That's the reducing of CO2 emissions. And you see in the following, there is the what is the trend in terms of fossil fuel and cement emissions. No signs of slowdown, or even with all these negotiations, technical level, political level, all kind of negotiations, it just keeps rising. Here is the, we are going to this very dangerous 4 degree world unless something is done. And here is the interesting picture. Here is present, and here is the past, like 60 million years ago. And this is CO concentration. I think it's something like 460 parts per million, and that's what we are planning to have. We think that it's a kind of accepted goal. And if you go to the like 8 million years, we have the same concentration, but the water level was 6 to 7 meters higher than today. And this is where we are going actually with this rate of emissions, and it goes to this 40 million years ago, where the sea level rise was like the water level was some 70 meters higher than today, and everybody can understand what that might mean for the future. So in the Mesarovich Negos, well, I don't think actually it was developed by you, but by you we are using that, was deemed to be useful in the 1991 demonstration in evaluating various negotiation positions, their implications, and thus reducing the scope of the issues to be negotiated and time needed for consensus to manageable proportions. So maybe this is a good idea also for the next negotiations. And we probably might have most advanced systems available today. But are we ready? Are the modeling experts ready? And now is the international community ready? And I think we can have this kind of model, or modeling environment or decision support system. It could show how CO2 emissions or greenhouse emissions in general would develop with various negotiation positions by groups and most relevant countries. And then secondly, so likely impact of various draft or negotiation draft deals on emissions, temperature rise, seawater rise, and other chosen parameters. So to kind of demonstrate what is happening. And it would be like a interactive IPCC system, but expanded and modified and put directly into the hands of negotiators. A little bit as we tried to do in 1992. But it could be publicly available, given to journalists and NGOs. And I think also the game should be developed for youth. There are various scary scenarios affecting one's own kind of house and summer place, etc. So that would be quite effective. And I think also a number of some of these kind of carbon tracker websites are available, but they should be systematized, expanded, and make user-friendly for negotiations. And then applications for smartphones, youth could play with different scenarios and how these negotiations affect them and put some pressure on negotiators. And so should we try again, in which we failed in 1991? I think that's our social responsibility, but time is short. These ideas could be discussed in this seminar symposium, which I mentioned. And in general, I believe that model builders, like Barry and you, others, I'm not, should organize themselves, unite themselves, and give their contribution to the international community in a more systematic and bolder way than before. And this would be a tribute to Mike Messerowitz and Mankind.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Let me make just two comments. One is, I have here 5-10 pages paper with the title, Will the Systems Biology Play the Role in 21st Century Sciences? Reminiscence of the role which physics played in the 20th century. Because a lot of this is Newtonian mechanics and variation of it. But to the extent that we have understanding how organization biology, right? That could be a new, if you like, guideline to do what we are doing. So this is just 3 pages emphasizing organizing principles as important. And the second, I'm motivating now just for fun to produce 5-10 pages on the question what could have happened now if somebody else than Putin is in Russia. Right?
Yeah.
I
Send it to the
just
Wall
to
Street Journal.
contemplate with whatever facts we have, right? Assuming there might be somebody else there.
Thank you very much. And I think we need to move on because we have 2 distinguished guests from our sister Canadian club. Robert Hoffman, who was the past chair of the Canadian Club, a member of the Club of Rome, and the head of what is it called? What If Technologies?
Yes.
Yes. Is going to speak briefly about Mankind at the Turning Point and other contributions of Usicore to the Club of Rome. I think it worth noting that much of the initial action, that is the first 2 reports, and then Jim Bodkin at Harvard's report on education, were all contributions from USA Corps members to the International Club of Rome. And then Sheila Murray will make some concluding remarks. Sheila is now the co-vice president with Aurelio Pache, the son of the founder, Roberto Pache, the son of Aurelio Pache, who was the founder of the Club of Rome. She is the first woman to have held any very high position in the international clubs. Robert.
Thank you very much. I came not prepared to speak. I must say I prepared a couple of pages of notes that are quite specific and that will be made available to everybody here. But I'm certainly capable of rambling on for a few minutes because all the topics that have been touched upon are very close to my heart. That I'm the founder of a company called What If Technologies should indicate the debt that our work, my work, owes to the work of Mike Messerowitz. He has been enormously influential. With that, I've got to tell you a little bit about what my work is about. Basically, I've had 2 careers. A career as a statistician at Statistics Canada, a position that I must say is very isolated. And I was hired into a group to do modeling work, strangely enough, at a statistical agency. And in particular, we were doing input-output modeling, and we actually compiled the first input-output table for Canada. Back, the reference year was 1961. And through those connections, I became very familiar with the work of Leontief. And indeed, I spent a semester at Harvard in his, what was then the Harvard Economic Research Project. When The Limits to Growth was published in 1972, it became terribly apparent that what that input-output work was missing was dynamics. No dynamics at all. And even from where I sit today, most economics has no dynamics in it either. And so we were influenced to bring together the activity analysis work of Leontief with the dynamics force. Now, what we saw, of course, is what you observed, is that the systems dynamics model, as it was applied to the globe, was too aggregate, it was too homogeneous throughout. And what the activity analysis work showed was the promise of bringing together more detailed activity analysis into a dynamic framework. Now, curiously, Leontief himself didn't resolve the dynamic problem, the dynamic input-output problem, until much, much later in his career. I believe it was the late 80s or mid-90s that his work took on this dynamic flavor. In any event, we built the first generation of these kinds of models at Statistics Canada. And then What If Technologies came into play in 1990, when the statistical agency tired of me, and I guess I tired of the statistical agency, and we set out on our own to do modeling. What we thought the world needed was a platform within which to do detailed dynamic activity modeling. And we set off to build such a platform, and we've been building it for the last 25 years. And it is now, I regard as being very advanced. We were influenced very early on by, as I said, by the work of Jay Forrester and Professor Mazarovich. So we built beginning in 1993, a small-scale global systems model, but built on these principles of openness, simulation, scenario analysis, and open to decision-making and learning. That little model exists to this day. It's being now used in several universities as a conceptual basis for looking at the issues of sustainability. So it deals with decoupling, it deals with recycling, it deals with efficiency and switching and all the kinds of things that in principle you want to be able to deal with over the issues of sustainability. We tried to launch this project to make it more than just a model of concept. I guess we were unsuccessful in so doing. But in the meantime, I was interested enough to join the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, thinking that would be an organization suitable for pursuing this sort of thing. It turned out really not to be. And since then, I've been associated with the Club of Rome itself as an associate member. To make the connections with the Club of Rome, it seems to me that the initiatives that the club took in the late 60s and early 70s, the work of Jay Forrester and Dennis Meadows and The Limits to Growth and Mankind at the Turning Point, really put the Club of Rome on the map as an institution that could catalyze, not necessarily carry out, but could catalyze this kind of project. The Club of Rome was instrumental in the establishment of IASA. I don't know if many of you know that history. But it was Aurelio Pache, even before the Club of Rome was formed, in conjunction with German Gaviciani, a Russian. He was in the Ministry of Technology, I think, at that time. Gaviciani went on to be the founding chair of the IASA Council, and an American was appointed to be the first director, and Howard Rafa. And Howard Rafa had been engaged in the negotiations over IASA since the beginning. Unfortunately, as it would turn out, when IASA was formed and was poised then to take on the mission of advancing global modeling, I understand it was the British, Sir Solly something or other, who said, IASA will not engage in global modeling, or we will withdraw our support from what was then the Royal Academy of Sciences. And so IASA never did fulfill this really intended mandate from its founders. What they did do, however, was to sponsor a series of conferences over probably the next 10 years that brought together all of the practitioners in global modeling. This work there's mounds of documentation, but of importance is a book by Donella Meadows, in which she was rapporteur for one of these conferences. And then she wrote a second book, which was called The Electronic Oracle, I think in 1985, but by that time the IASA activity had just about died out. So that was one of the areas in which this body of work really, I think, had a great deal of potential that has not been realized. Global modeling initiatives basically left the map in and around the 1980s and disappeared, with the exception probably of your work, Barry. But I think global modeling has never ever reached its potential, especially if the philosophy that you had espoused had been realized. Interestingly enough, I relate very much to your reference to the work of Noble and music as life, or life as music. It seems to me that does point the way in which more efforts should be placed, very much so. And it's a beautifully written little book if you haven't come across it yet. Where does this lead? I think it is perhaps time for the Club of Rome to refocus and to take an initiative in the domain of global modeling, starting off perhaps with the suggestions that you made with bringing together some of the practitioners in the field, but then moving beyond that in order to stimulate and bring together the funding for a larger scale project. Unlike Barry, I don't think that the integrated assessment modeling holds a great deal of promise. To be quite frank, I think the modeling that supports the IPCC are what I call models of science. Scientists build models of the relationships that they understand. They don't build models in order to communicate an understanding of the issues or the systems in which we need to play an active role. And so strangely enough, those models now, the integrated assessment models, are largely models still of comparative statics. You do detailed dynamics minute by minute or 5-minute intervals over a year, and then you say, well, now we have this structure. What would it look like 50 years away? So you change the starting values for the year and then run it through the year. And I think one of the reasons why the IPCC has failed to be effective is because it lacks the tools to do truly integrated and dynamic modeling work. It doesn't know what the word synthesis is, all it understands is writing chapters in a book on each discipline in the science, one after the other. And it has really failed to communicate an understanding of this enormously complex system. Sheila's just tapped me on the shoulder to say I probably talked long enough.
This is a
And I
very
probably have.
wonderful
Thank
set
you.
of suggestions and where to go from here. It would be silly for a bunch of futurists to sit around and not contemplate what future should come from the discussion.
I just make one comment. Actually, I think one thing that we might think about is search for organizing principles to understand complexity. That is you sort of looking into next step, because that is what is essential to understand. And in that respect, again, biology has a lot to say. And it is amazing that President Obama has proposed $100 million a year to build a model of the brain, right? With enormous amount of data, without concept what they're trying to do, except measure everything and describe, right? But as I think Darwin said, that you have to start the view to see whether it will be of any service, right? Rather than like Obama proposed, but I don't think it's going to succeed because of the amount of money and so on. $100 million per year for several years to develop a model of the brain based on data. But in parallel with this, a small group of people, 2 or 3 or 4, whatnot, right, should look into brain, right, and try to see what are the organizing principles for this, and that will provide the impetus for the next direction.
Thank you.
May I respond just briefly?
Quickly.
One of the starting points for me with respect to organizing principle is a paper by Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, I think published in 1994, if I'm not mistaken, which is a very interesting and very, very high-level approach to the organizing principles. And I take very much your comments. One other comment that I would like to make, and I'll quote you back. The main obstacles are doctrines that clutter the mind.
Yeah.
I was trained as an economist. Macroeconomics is such a doctrine that clutters the mind.
Yes, definitely. We all agree on that.
That's what
Yes.
Krugman really referred to, right?
Now, women have the last word here.
Yes.
Thank you.
First and last.
First and last, yes, that's right. So with great pleasure, Sheila Murray is the vice chair of the International Club of Rome, and she's the past chair of the Canadian, our sister, sister Club of Rome, and has been a driving force in many institutions in Canada, both within the government and in private sector. And Sheila is given the pleasant and unpleasant task of winding some of this together.
Oh. Thank you so much, Anitra. I'll echo what Barry's comments, and I'm sure those people around the table. Thank you for organizing this event. Many of us, including me, I can only speak for myself, obviously, have attended many meetings, and many of them so bureaucratic that you just are desperate to escape. And I must say that reminds me of my time as a senior executive in the federal government in Canada, trying to reconcile competing visions in order to get the paper on the Prime Minister's desk by Tuesday. And that's why I asked you the question about being an engineer, an electrical engineer, and working with economists. I'm married to an electrical engineer who has spent his life in the computer-based systems world.
Yeah.
And so to reconcile that takes enormous talent, patience, understanding, and as you said, learning, moving into the learning mode.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anitra, for your introduction of me. I'm still amazed at being a vice president of the Club of Rome. I don't know how it happened, but my life has been filled with serendipity. So I'm not to question, but rather to get on with the activities that are necessary. And I would like to think that this meeting is a breakthrough meeting for many of us, and certainly for me. There are very few meetings in which head and heart come together. And as an adult educator for, I guess, forever, I find that that's where head and heart come together. And I would say that having been privileged and honored by Dr. Mazarevich's presence and his commentary, I think that is what we need to regard as the breakthrough issue today to spur us on in our national associations and also at the Club of Rome. Knowing you're a national treasure in the United States, I hope in Canada we can bask in that glory as well. We've known your name for so long. Many of our members have said, what's happening with Dr. Mazarevich? And so now I can go back and say, let me tell you what's happening. Of course, Robert and I work very closely together. As well, I thought I would mention, because I'm not sure whether I should feel guilty about this, but I have a book that was sent by Claire Brewer, Jr.
Yes, sir.
from the Systems Research Center, and under Mankind at the Turning Point, it says Project Strategy for Survival in Handwriting. And this was sent to John Bradley, who was Secretary Treasurer of the Canadian Association when Rennie Whitehead was a founder. And John recently died and left his library to me. And so I've had the pleasure over the last month since Anitra invited me to make comments of being a student once again, and it's the right time of year. I felt that old urge to cram. So I've had the opportunity to really read your book, and I think this is a first edition.
Yes.
So it's really a treasure. And also to go through this book, 100 Pages for the Futures, Reflections of the President of the Club of Rome, and that was Aurelio Pache. And in it, he lauds the work of Dr. Mazarevich and Dr. Pestel. And so I won't go, yes, I won't go any further. I think, Anitra, you'll forgive me if I don't go into any lengthy comments on Limits to Growth, the 30-year update, and so on. All to say that Dennis Meadows, when he received a prize in Japan, more or less admitted that sustainability as he understood it is pretty well gone, passé. Now one might say that he's a pessimist, but I think he's a realist, and he reiterated that at the meeting at the Smithsonian to celebrate the 40th anniversary. And again, we had him speak at a conference, No Growth Symposium in Ottawa. Now, countering that is Jürgen Randers in his new book, 2052, looking forward.
Yes.
And I was privileged to respond to that,
Yeah.
having received the book online 2 days before I left for Rotterdam. But he uses essentially your model. And he says, you know, that he thinks the basic issue is the lack of political will. And so there's the human element again. And we may have to think about the human element as needing to be refurbished. Because that lack of political will is killing us all around the world. It's killing us in the Club of Rome, but I didn't say that. But I think Tapio said that. And so we need to leapfrog, in my view, from where we are to where we think we should be, where we want to be. And I would think the organizing principles are absolutely essential to that kind of project.
Understand complexity.
Yes, yeah. So I just like to say you introduced a whole new language in the book. Where is it?
He's
Oh, that's good. I have one 2052 and I lent it to someone and it's disappeared forever. But I was struck by the language that we now accept in all our discussions, including today. We talk about the network of linkages, we talk about inclusion rather than exclusion, the human element, we talk about assumptions, scenario building. We use your idea of a flexible computer-based planning instrument with a regional model of the world system to report on analysis of long-term development. But that's what policymakers need. They need the assistance in decision-making and planning. They need to be anticipatory and participatory. Because unless we include the populations in the regions and be open to participation, and that's a huge job, we're really sunk. The Arab Spring, it seems to me, is misnamed. It's really a spring for every country if we listen to it carefully. So all your language of culture, regional diversity, interactivity, interdependence, we take that for granted, but you put it in the book. And so we're all the beneficiaries of your work, both in modeling, but also the language. Anitra, I'm conscious of the time and we need time for questions. So I would like to thank you again. And Anitra, as you may know, is a very active member of the Club of Rome. And she's been actually my mentor. When I first met Anitra and Andrew in Amsterdam, I thought, oh, finally, I've met somebody that I can kind of connect with. And particularly, I've got a background in community development, and as I mentioned, adult education, distance education, and so on. And of course, that is the largest education system in the world, that non-certificate, although there are certificates obviously, but it is found around the world. I've done work in Bangladesh with the Open University, and I think within 2 years through the distance programs, they had 500,000 students involved. And of course, there's no money for this, so the telephone is for tutors, and illiterate people teach illiterate people how to read. And we know about the Grameen Bank. And Andrew Orkey, and I used to chat when we had a few minutes about community development and all the work that he did around the world. And I think he must be smiling on you today for organizing this. So thank you to the United States Club of Rome, Association of the Club of Rome. And it would be, well, I need to mention that the roots for conservation in the United States, as you all know, go back to the Civil War, when the devastation was such that people said, we can't do this again. That is the origins of the Club of Rome. After World War II, the devastation was so great that the group of international public servants, led by Aurelio Pache, who worked for Fiat and an industrialist, they said, we've got to do something. I think we're at that kind of stage now that we're saying we've got to do something. I mean, all the decisions, etc., made by our organizations, our governments, yield nothing in the sense of changing the pattern and the path that we're on. So I think we have to do that. But you have John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, for Yosemite National Park, and you've got, as you have mentioned, Anitra, so many people, including all the members around the table here, who have made enormous contributions nationally, and I should say locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And that needs to be recognized. We all look to the United States for leadership. And that doesn't mean we say we don't have any leadership in our own association, but we're fellow travelers. So Rob mentioned Rafa, you did as well. Harrison Brown was actually vice chair of IASA. Alan McDonald, who was a public administrator, worked at IASA right at the beginning. And that's really important in building the infrastructure. E.O. Wilson, of course, Barry Hughes, Tapio, Hazel Henderson, and I can go on. But you have all the people who are listed on the invitation are really important, and they're important to us in Canada because we know that we can pick up the phone and say, what are you doing? How are you doing? Can we join in, or we plan to do this? Would you like to be involved? And Rob and I talked about a series of symposia, and Tapio's given us a lot of interest. This is, Anitra, your book on the future of the Western Hemisphere was an example of how you bring people together to contribute. And also you and Barry on the chapter on modeling. I think you should include yourself as part of the modeling group.
I just sat and ran the instrument. I was the driver, he was the
The person is-
This is, this is very important because, I look back and I don't understand, let me say again, why this is not called the Sarah Gustav Barry Hughes model, because that was it. But somehow, if you're first, you not learn everything. And I like to make two very short personal comments, if I may. I have not attended any meeting in the last 5 years. I came here only because of you. No, honest.
Yeah.
I just don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And the second thing I want to say is also very personal. Is Herbert Sanger wrote a book, Models of Life, right? And I am writing my biography entitled Life with the Turning Points. Just get the invitation from MIT to get out of the hall, right? And then my brother killed in the World War II 1 week after armistice, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And that is the personal biography which I'm writing relatively short. But again, life with the turning points, either by outside events or initiated by myself.